City and County of Broomfield. Thank you for joining us for the Midway Boulevard Multimodal Plan. Thank you for joining us for the Midway Boulevard Multimodal Plan. It is September 23rd. Next slide, please. So a couple of housekeeping items here for interpretation. Please connect using a tablet or computer. And go to the globe icon in the bottom right of your screen. And please select the language of your preference, English or Spanish, and that goes for all listeners this evening. We've also put the information in the chat for everyone to follow along with the instructions.
Thanks, Sarah. We're gonna
Thank you.
Luz Maria, I think you are still muted. So if you want to unmute and then go through that in Spanish.
Ok, para escuchar la interpretación, por favor conectarse utilizando la tableta o computadora, pulse el icono del globo en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla y seleccione el lenguaje de su preferencia.
Great, thank you. So we'll pause and let everybody select.
Ok, vamos a hacer una pausa y todos van a escoger.
There you go. Everyone should be able to see the globe in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to select your language.
Okay, looks like our interpretation channel is working now. Luz Maria, thank you for being here. Let me know if we need to wait another second, otherwise I'll just keep moving. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. I'm Alicia Zimmerman. I'm with the project team, and I'm going to move you through some rules of engagement and some orientation for today's meeting. And then Mark Ambrosi and I are going to tag team the technical content. So let's get into the background here. As far as how we're going to conduct this meeting, we're going to use the Q&A box, and I'll go through that in a second. Excuse me, or raise your hand during the Q&A session at the end of each topic. So we'll have some breaks to answer questions in short. But overall, our goal for this meeting is to hear your voices, hear your, I guess I should say your virtual voices, your thoughts on the project. And we want to make sure we're respectful of the other meeting participants and the project team, and of course not use profanities or inappropriate language or anything like that. So, and a note, as you've guessed, we are going to try and speak slowly and pause, which is challenging for anybody, but particularly me. And so we'll try and be deliberate so that everybody can follow the meeting and that everybody, the language can be translated and interpreted. Orientation for Zoom, if you're not familiar, and this can be set up a little bit differently than other Zoom meetings anyway. So go ahead and make sure you're paying attention here because it might look different. Our meeting is being recorded. Everybody is muted to start with. So if you don't see, if you see it grayed out, that's why. And as I mentioned, we're using the Q&A, question and answer box for any questions you have throughout the project. There is a chat icon here that you can open that one as well. We're going to try and focus that one on answers to our poll questions, but we'll keep an eye on both of them. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, focus on this Q&A box here. And we will have polling sessions throughout. Again, please be respectful of your neighbors. And if you want to follow up and watch the meeting again or pass the meeting on to your friends and neighbors, or if we don't get to all questions today, please take a look after the meeting, possibly tomorrow, but most likely Monday, at Broomfield Voice pedestrianrefuge.com/midwayplan. And the project hotline number, we'll repeat these again at the end, is 303-464-5827. So we're going to get into the first polling session, do a little bit of a practice round, and also get to know the folks who are on the call today. Looks like we have a smaller group today, so hopefully we can have some good discussion. In just a second here, I'm going to open a polling window. It'll pop up on your screen and you'll be able to select answers. You just have to follow those instructions, and then I'll close the poll in about a minute. The first one is easy. It's basically just about what your interest in the corridor is. So I'm going to pull that up now. Okay. All right. Everybody should see this poll. So you are allowed to select multiple answers and go ahead and start answering. Okay. Looks like we've gotten a few answers in. I'm going to let it sit for just another second or two here. Okay. Okay. I'm going to end this poll and share the results just so you all can see who's here. We have people that live within 1 mile of the corridor and then live in broader Broomfield and travel the corridor. So that's great. That's a good breadth of perspective that we can hopefully have some good Q&A here. Okay, so moving on, this is the first Q&A session, and we usually just have this here in case there are technical questions. And I haven't seen any questions in the Q&A box, so we're going to go ahead and move on. As far as presentation overview, as I mentioned, we're going to give you a little bit of background. We're here for the the Midway Multimodal Action Plan. And so Mark will go through project background of how this project came to be. And then we'll talk through existing conditions that we've gathered so far, and also some kind of toolbox ideas. So we're not going to be proposing any, design solutions or alternatives yet. This is to gather your feedback. And part of that is us saying, hey, here's the world of possibilities. What do you think? So that'll be the last session. And we have this meeting will go till 8:30, and we have a lot of content. So we'll try and make sure to give enough time for Q&A and get you out of here at 8:30. Each session, the existing conditions and the toolbox will also have polling and Q&A. Before we get into the technical content, though, I want to go through a few common terms used tonight. I recognize some names, so I know that this is repeat for some of you, but I want to make sure everybody is comfortable with the terms that they may not have heard before. There are 3 slides on this. The first of which is pretty straightforward, is something that you're hearing more and more these days, is multimodal. Multimodal just means multiple modes of travel or transportation. And a mode of transportation is what method you use to, move yourself. Usually we think of the ones traveling in a vehicle, traveling by, transit, bus, something like that. Walking, wheeling on the sidewalk, wheelchairs, and some other wheeled vehicles or wheeled people using wheels. And then those on bicycle, and that could be different locations depending on, particular use, comfort level, and facilities available. So that's what multimodal means in the perspective that we're looking at tonight. When we look behind, what we say behind the back of curb, so between the curb and the buildings or the park or whatever, sidewalk, most people are familiar with that term, but the sidewalk that I've shown in yellow here is what we would call a detached sidewalk, which means it's separated from that curb. And an attached sidewalk would be in this orange area shown right here. Again, attached to the curb. Those have different comfort levels and we have different conditions throughout the corridor. So we'll talk through those as we go through this as well. And I've also shown the word multi-use path here. And the reason that's not called out specifically is because multi-use paths look a lot different depending on where they are. Generally, they are wider than a typical sidewalk because they're designed with the intent to accommodate bicycles, people on bicycles, people walking, people in wheelchairs, people with strollers. And so they're usually wider and quite often detached from the curb. So we'll see some examples of those. And you all have examples of those on the corridor already. The last one here, there are a lot of call outs here, especially these yellow images or these yellow areas. This first one is a pedestrian refuge. And that pedestrian refuge is just, usually a raised island in the middle of a roadway between the directions of vehicular travel. So a pedestrian can get partway across the road and wait in a safe spot before they go the rest of the way. Bump outs here are these yellow areas that are usually at corners, not always, or usually at intersections, not always. And they often kind of, shadow this, a parking lane or something like that. And we'll talk about what they do and why we would consider them later, but that's a bump out. I also have bike facilities as a general category here. I know my husband always bugs me about this one, that facilities isn't necessarily a normal term. So what we call a bike facility is any, treatment on the road that or on or off the road that accommodates a bicycle. And bicycle facilities range from including a dedicated space on the road for somebody riding a bicycle, or a shared use path for somebody riding a bicycle, all the way to a sharrow within the travel lane. And that's still technically considered a bicycle facility. Talk through those later as well. So two types of bicycle facility that some folks are less familiar: protected bike lanes. In this image, in this graphic, this protected bike lane is separated by a curb and median, separated from vehicular traffic by a vertical element, curb, post, something. The difference with a buffered bike lane is it is horizontally separated, not vertically. And so with a horizontal separation, we consider it a buffered bike lane. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark to talk about the project background.
All right, thank you, Alicia. My name is Mark Ambrosi. I'm a senior transportation planner with the City and County of Broomfield. And I am project manager on the Broomfield side for this project that we're talking about tonight. Next slide, please. So the first thing I want to talk about relating to the project background is the 2016 Transportation Plan. This plan lays out the policies and strategies that guide transportation planning in Broomfield. It was put together with input from the public and residents in Broomfield. So your voice has really kind of shaped the policies that are guiding our approach to this project. There are a few things I want to touch on that came out of this plan. This is the vision for the plan written on the left side of the screen. The first one is multimodal transportation. So this plan tells staff that we are planning for all modes of transportation. This includes pedestrians, bicyclists, automobiles, buses, not just people in their personal automobile. The second thing that I want to point out is that we are planning for people of all ages and abilities. So this plan established policies to ensure that we are providing a safe, functional transportation system for all users, whether that's children, older adults, people with disabilities, and then, everybody else in the community. The last thing I want to talk about briefly is reducing the dependence on single occupancy vehicles. So this plan asked Broomfield staff to find strategies that can provide people with transportation choices to get around the community. And so it's not to say we don't want people driving, but we do want to make sure that there are other options available to people who live here. Next slide, please. The next document I want to talk about was developed in 2019. It is our bicycle and pedestrian assessment. This plan looked at Broomfield's overall transportation system and through the lens of bicyclists and pedestrians, and kind of identified the safety of our system, where we have connections today, and where we have maybe some deficiencies within the community, and we need additional connections. So Midway Boulevard really rose to the top in this plan. It was identified as a priority to turn into a low stress network, which makes sense because it connects from the western side of Broomfield all the way out east through the community. It was this third highest corridor in the community for comments from the public. And so the only two other corridors were Sheps Crossing over by Industrial Lane, and then Industrial Lane itself. So this was a really important corridor based on the amount of feedback that we received. It was also identified as a priority bicycle corridor in the community, and the public identified that it has some improvements it needs to sidewalks throughout the corridor. So some of those gaps we need to fill in, and overall just kind of make it a more complete corridor. Next slide, please. So this project, we are looking at all of Midway Boulevard, and this extends from the Lake Link Trail on the west, where there's a little cul-de-sac, all the way out east, actually into Westminster by the Dry Creek Trail. And in this graphic, I just want to point out that there are a number of facilities that are either on or close to the corridor. And so this includes things like schools, municipal buildings like City Hall, DMV, the library, open space throughout the corridor, places of worship, and then community facilities like Fish and Health and Human Services. Next slide, please. So why are we meeting tonight? We're here because we need your input. We need the public's input to make sure that this corridor is safer and more equitable for everybody using it. And your voice is really essential for the development of this corridor. We want to make sure that whatever comes out of this study, the recommendations, work for the people who live here. Next slide, please. So next, I'm going to talk a little about the schedule. The first thing I want to point out is the public engagement. It's the big circle on the top, and as you'll notice, it is part of every element of this study. So from the very beginning all the way through to project implementation, which is actually beyond the scope of this study. And now walking through kind of our schedule, we kicked the project off in the spring of 2021, so earlier this year, and came up with a strategy to approach the study. Through the spring and kind of just wrapping up now, we've been doing data collection and analysis. We also kicked off the public engagement on the Broomfield Voice page, where people have opportunities to comment on a map. We've also been out at a few events in the community where we had other opportunities for public engagement. The next phase, so shortly after we hold this round of public meetings, we'll be moving into alternative development and concept design. And so what we're going to do here is work with the consultant team to identify probably 2 or 3 different potential strategies for different locations on the corridor. These would be improvements. They may be things like operational changes. So, changing the striping a little bit, changing the signal timing. And yeah, we're going to put together a package with a couple of different alternatives. Following that up, we'll have a second round of public meetings where we'll be reaching out again to get public feedback about the alternatives and to understand which alternative the public likes best. And so that allows us to come up with one kind of consistent strategy throughout the corridor. Moving into the winter, we will be doing some prioritization of the projects from that preferred concept. And the consultant team will be putting together cost estimates for individual projects along the corridor. So this is going to give us an order of magnitude cost for these projects and give us an idea of how much it's going to, how much funding we need to identify to get some of these projects done. Finally, moving into the spring, this is all going to come together in a plan. And we'll be sharing that with the community. This is going to set us up to begin implementation, which is following the project. Probably in 2022, we will be taking on some of the kind of lower hanging fruit projects that this plan identifies. And this could be things like striping in new bike lanes in areas that we have opportunities, maybe filling in some small sections of sidewalk gaps. But overall, this plan is intended to set us up for about 10 to 15 years of projects that we'll be doing as we identify funding. Next slide, please. Next, we're going to get into a little of the existing conditions preview here. So this is from the data that we collected throughout the spring and into the summer. And we're going to share some of that with you now. Next slide, please. So this first graphic here lays out kind of some of the basics of the corridor as it exists today. So the arrows on the, I guess, just above and below the corridor, those are generally the lane configuration. So in the areas where you see one arrow, that would be generally a single lane. There may be some turn lanes and other things in there as well, but generally it's a single through lane. And as you move east of Sheridan Boulevard, we're looking at a 4-lane section, pretty much all the way through to Zunai. Other things on this slide, you'll notice the stoplights. Those are indicative of signalized stop lights in the community. There are also dots and little stars that identify areas that we have crosswalks with state yield signs, and the stars are actually crosswalks with flashing beacons, so a little bit more protection. And at the bottom of this slide here, you'll see just the existing speed limits on the corridor. All right, next slide. All right, so this is pretty straightforward. This is average daily vehicle traffic on the corridor. There's a pretty wide range of traffic volumes that we'll see starting on the very eastern side, western side, west of US 287, we have the lowest traffic volumes. That kind of makes sense. Over there, the land uses are more industrial. There's not the residential, and the road kind of terminates at the end. As you move east along the corridor, you see some pretty significant traffic volumes. So between US 287 and Main Street, we're over 17,000 vehicles per day in some areas, slightly more moderate traffic volumes between Main Street and Sheridan, but still pretty high. And then as you move east of Sheridan, you see those traffic volumes climbing again to, over 15,000 generally, which is a pretty significant number. Next slide, please. So this slide here is pretty interesting, and I think it's pretty telling of how the corridor is actually used. I'm going to walk through it, focusing on the top half of the slide first. So what we're seeing here, if we look at US 287, there's the vehicle with the 12% above it. That 12% represents the percentage of total vehicles that pass through that intersection that continue along the corridor all the way to Zunai. As you move to the east, obviously you'll see higher numbers of those vehicles moving all the way to Zunai. But what this means is that 90% of those vehicles that are getting onto Midway Boulevard at US 287 aren't continuing all the way through the corridor. Now we see something very similar on the westbound trips on the bottom half here, where again, about 90% of vehicles aren't continuing all the way to US 287. So what does that mean? And we're going to jump to the next slide here. So this is important. Most of these trips on Midway are not cut through traffic. It is not regional traffic coming from Thornton or somewhere else using Midway as a cut through, so they don't have to take 120th or 136th. This is people who live on or near the corridor, using the corridor to get somewhere on or near the corridor. So when we're talking about traffic volumes and speeding, that's really the people who live in this area. So that's just something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So here we have a bit of the crash history. And so what we're looking at is a 5-year crash history for vehicles and a 7-year crash history for bicyclists and pedestrians. Kind of going back to the 2019 pedestrian and bicycle assessment, that assessment told us that 20% of all of the pedestrian and bicycle accidents in Broomfield happen on Midway Boulevard. That is important. That is one of the reasons we are really focusing on making safety improvements, making this corridor more comfortable for pedestrians and bicyclists. Now, we also have a number of vehicular crashes through this corridor, particularly at some of the intersections and some of those higher traffic volume areas. So we are also going to be planning for vehicular safety. We want this corridor to work well for all modes. And yeah, this is just something that I wanted to point out to everybody. Next slide, please. Now we have a little bit of the speed data here. I want to first point out that this speed data is 85th percentile speed data, and it's averaged over the course of an entire 24-hour period. So there may be times of the day that these numbers don't necessarily reflect what we're seeing out there on the road. At the top, we again have the existing speed limits, and just below the corridor, you'll see that 85th percentile speed. And so on the very eastern side of the corridor, and kind of continuing west to Sheridan, see that people are moving pretty fast. It's going from about 5 to 10 miles an hour over the speed limit on average over the course of a day. Now, if you look between Main Street and US 287, somebody pointed out that, hey, that's not my experience in this area. I think that people drive faster. This area gets very congested during the morning and afternoon commute times. And so vehicles during those congested periods are going slower because there are so many vehicles out there. That may be bringing down the 85th percentile speed. If we were to take a closer look at this section of the roadway, we may see times of the day where that speed is quite a bit higher than it's showing on this graphic. All right, next slide, please. Oh, all right. Well, I'll be turning it back over to Alicia to take us away on the rest of our existing conditions information.
Thanks, Mark. So I think there's the question of, okay, now we have this existing conditions information, and that, I should note, is not all we have. It's just kind of an overview of some of the ones we thought people may be interested in. So we have this data, and what does it mean for concept and alternative development on Midway? And I'm going to focus on maybe one example of what we do with that type of data. The example I'm showing here is a bicycle facility example. Helps us figure out what type of bike facility is appropriate given the data that we just shared. And the reason I'm showing this example is because bicycle facility selection and even bicycle facility type, different types are, you know, a little bit newer within the realm of public works and transportation projects. Certainly being done around the country successfully. Broomfield is just now getting into some of this stuff. And, you know, Broomfield uses national and local guidelines and standards. And this FHWA, Federal Highway Administration, FHWA, preferred bikeway type graph schematic, speed versus volume chart, and it's new, it's relatively newly issued. So we take this chart of volume on one side and speed on the other, and basically we excuse me, basically we plot the speed, in this case, it's speed limit. It would change even a little with that 85th percentile speed versus the number of vehicles per day on the roadway. What we've plotted so far is what the ADT or average daily traffic that was measured. Certainly discussions of what might be out there in the future, that type of thing. But right now, just looking at what was measured, 2 locations, both west of 287, are even on the chart. One of them obviously close to this kind of area that's transitioning into a bike lane, potentially buffered bike lane. The other one right at kind of the corner of it, moving into a separated bike lane or shared use path. Protected bike lane is another name for separated. But the other 4 locations that we noted here were all above the chart, which you can imply that this blue, you need more separation for people on bicycles, extends up to that area, but they are well into the need for separated bike lane or shared use path. And I've given some examples over here on the right of what these types of bike lanes are. Just as I mentioned, we'll talk more about the benefits, but just to keep a picture in your mind, this shared lane here is this white box, and it's a sharrow or a shared lane marking. You actually have one of these on Midway in this section. Let's see, right here. That's where you currently have a sharrow. And then buffered bike lane, again, we talked about what it is with that horizontal space, and then 2 examples of separated or protected bike lanes, which would be the navy blue. So that's one of the type of things that we do with that data. Again, talking a little bit about more why a lot of this new discussion is sometimes focused on people on bicycles. This is just a study that was done by a guy named Roger Geller a little while ago, who basically wanted to know what types of bicyclists there are. If you ask the general population what their level of interest and comfort with bicycling is, what would the answer be? And his percentages actually have been confirmed by multiple studies since then, including our study relatively recently in the Denver metro area that confirms these percentages. And I'm reading the percentages here in case they're hard to read. 4% of people are highly confident bicyclists. 12% of people are somewhat confident, and 59% are what we call interested but concerned. Means obviously they want a bicycle, but they might be concerned about some reasons for not bicycling. And then there are 25% of the population that we say, no way, no how. They're not interested in being on a bicycle. And so we've shown them as pedestrians because everybody is a pedestrian at some point in their trip. 2 things that are important about this information: 16% of people is all the people that are regularly comfortable biking today, 16%. But if we look at here we go, people who want to bicycle, they're interested but concerned, 60% of our population would ride a bicycle if it were safer and more convenient. So that's one of the reasons you'll hear me focus when we're talking about bicycle facilities specifically on the interested but concerned population. We want to make sure that Broomfield is providing mode choice. And right now there's, in some of the transportation modes, there isn't much of a choice for particular sections of these roadways. Quickly too, I would like to go through the community feedback, the community outreach process we're doing and what we've done so far. So far, we're taking a multi-prong approach. We've had 3 public meetings this week at different times of day, all with interpretation services because we want to reach the kind of biggest breadth of population as we can. We're also, in this case, have been to 2 pop-up meetings or events. This one is Mark at the National Night Out, and we also were at Broomfield Days talking to the public, and we got a lot of input. It was great. We had people at the booth, both of those booths, a good percentage of the time that we were out there. Mentioned the 3 online workshops this week. We are doing question of the week on the Broomfield Voice Project webpage, as well as on social media. We have 177 online map-based comments as of the end of August, which is great because that was just after launch. And then, excuse me, we've also been doing direct mail. The comms department in Broomfield has been really hitting this hard and doing direct mail postcards to residents in English and Spanish, as well as social media, comments, likes, shares, impressions, just ways of getting people's feedback and getting the word out. This is the quick screenshot of the comments on the online map. And I know some of the folks here are participating in this. So please, if you haven't, feel free to get on and add your comments. Any comments we get through any other forum, whether it be in person or this meeting, we will also be adding here. So they'll all be, documented in one place. And this, as I mentioned, has a lot. If you zoom in at any of these specific things, those dots go to a specific location. So you can click on a specific location, say exactly what your concern or what you like about it. And it's a great way to get your feedback. This is a snapshot of what we're hearing so far. As of the end of August, we had 252 comments total, which included the one in-person outreach event. And so far, we're not looking at this as the end all be all, but it's good feedback as we go through. We read every comment. So, the whole design team is processing these and thinking about these. And so far, the snapshot tells us that crossing concerns, intersection concerns, bike facilities are the top 3 concerns, but we've absolutely gotten a decent amount of input on many of the other. Traffic congestion, and I know we heard a lot more about traffic congestion in person at Broomfield Voice as well. Crash concerns and bike lane discomfort are the next 3. Okay, with that, I'm going to try and finish this existing conditions section. We're going to do a quick poll on the existing conditions that we've shared with you. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session. I've been seeing some good Q&A discussion here. We'll go over those. And but first we'll do our poll. And this poll, before I pull it up, this poll has 2 questions in it. And I'm posting them both at the same time for a reason. They're very nuanced because the first question is asking about what if the existing conditions data we presented matches your experience, specifically how you experienced Midway. The second question is, okay, whether or not it matches my experience, can I believe that this data is accurate and get behind it? And then you're welcome to share if it doesn't match your experience, or if you don't, aren't comfortable or don't believe some of the data, tell us in the chat what you don't. So here, I'm going to launch this and we'll let you read it for a second here. Okay, you all are quick. I think we have everybody. Okay, I'm going to hit end poll here. Share results. Okay, so the answers in this, and it's interesting to see between our public meetings, the split of answers has changed on each. In this one, it looks like this data reflects your experiences and you agree with the data. So you're still welcome to put information in the chat if there's something else that we missed or that you think might be a little off or different about it. So feel free to do that whenever, but I am going to stop sharing those answers and then go to our Q&A here. Looks like at least I think it was John has been submitting through the Q&A. And I don't believe we have anybody on the phone, But just in case we do, if you're on the phone, you can type *9 to raise your hand and we'll come and call on you. The 3 questions I've seen so far are, what is the first highest priority for a low stress network? You may remember that we mentioned that Midway was the 2nd priority. And so John, I think, is wondering, well, what was the first one? And Sarah answered it here. Cole Street ranked the highest alongside Midway, which is interesting because we'll talk a little bit about Cole and Midway as we get up here. And she also mentions that we'll be, I think it was Sarah that responded, we will be working on some signing and striping to improve this residential street. Midway is a bit more complex, and that's why, you know, we are where we are, moving into a full in-depth look and project on it. So looks like the first project is, or the first priority is also being addressed currently. And then the second question is, are crash statistics publicly available online? And the link was provided in the answer. Please let us know if you can't see those answers. Once we respond, they should be published, or they should be pop up on your screen in the Q&A. So John, thank you for that question as well. Let us know if you didn't get that, URL. And then the last question, also from John, excuse me, does the FHWA model take into account vehicle size? If I remember high school physics, an 18-wheeler moving 35 miles an hour will do a lot more damage than a sedan traveling 35. Midway west of 287 has a lot of big trucks on it due to industrial businesses. And he notes that he'll put that on the comment map. Great, put it on there. That's a really good question. The chart itself does not include, you know, kind of the nuance of vehicle size, but a lot of agencies are developing their own criteria, and even some of the national guidelines that do say over X% of heavy vehicles. And heavy vehicle can be defined by the agency as well. But like you said, an 18-wheeler or semi, over X%, you know, automatically qualifies it for separation or protection or off-street. So that's something that we will consider moving forward as well. And, you know, you bring up a good point about some sections of this roadway that have more truck traffic. So thanks for that question.
I just add to that one of the big goals of this study is creating a comfortable corridor. And so I know for me personally, when I am passed by a tractor trailer or semi, that's pretty uncomfortable. And so, you know, finding solutions that can help move people on their bicycles or walking and create a little space between those large vehicles and the people doing the activity, that's going to be something we're looking closely at.
And I also just noticed that Sarah actually put the link to where the FHWA addresses that. So as I said, many agencies have their own you know, specific call outs, and she found the FHWA addressing that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. And I think I'll add to that with this plan, we'll also be looking at short-term fixes and also some of the more long-term fixes. So for example, that segment US 287 towards the Lake Link Trail, we do think that it would be very relatively inexpensive to put in some bike lanes, but we can also look at the more long-term solutions that will be more expensive, but we'll need to weigh that against all the data that we have and what that expense will be and program that appropriately.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, I think we're caught up on questions. So feel free to keep submitting them and we'll get to them at the next Q&A, but we will, yep, looks like it. We will go ahead and move forward. I'm gonna pass it back to Mark here.
All right, thanks, Alicia. So in this section, we're going to begin talking about some of the items in our toolbox and some of the ideas that we're going to be considering as we move forward into the alternatives development. But first, we're going to talk about how we're thinking about the corridor. So next slide, please. So what this graphic is showing is how we've broken up the corridor into different segments to help us think about how the characters are a little different, the needs are a little different, the land uses are a little different, and make sure that we are finding solutions that aren't a one size fits all, but are really catered to the specific needs of that area. And so we just had a nice discussion about that very western section, west of US 287. It's very industrial. You see some trucks. And so we've categorized that as its own thing. We do similar things throughout the corridor, and the images below kind of give an idea of those different character areas throughout the corridor. We're not capturing everything, obviously, but these are just an example of some of the differences you'll feel when you're on Midway Boulevard. Next slide, please. So I'm going to jump right into talking about that section between Lake Link Trailhead and US 287. We have this great image here showing one of those large tractor trailers. You'll notice there's no bike lanes. There are narrow attached sidewalks in this section. There's a whole lot of pavement between the two curbs. And so this is an area that we think at minimum we can do some restriping and reshape this section of the corridor to make it a little more accommodating for bicyclists and pedestrians. One of the things about this section of the corridor is the land uses adjacent to it are a little bit more industrial. And so this is not, today, particularly the area you're going to want to go out after dinner on a walk, but we hope to turn it into something that feels a little bit more comfortable for everybody out there. Next slide, please. So US 287 to Main Street the way we have broken this up is actually into two sections. This section of roadway overall has the highest traffic volume of the entire corridor and has significant crashes. This area is categorized by kind of a mix of travel lanes. So primarily you have one through lane, but you have all kinds of turn lanes going off in different directions, and there's limited space between the curbs, and there's ultimately limited right of way in this area. The bicycle facilities through this area are pretty inconsistent, I'd say, on the entire stretch between US 287 and Main. You can see in this image down in the bottom left, we have a shared bike lane, and so that's sharing it with the vehicles out there. There are those high traffic volumes. Up to the upper right, there's actually a striped bike lane, and it's adjacent to parking, which can also cause its own problems with people opening doors. And then we have the section down at the bottom with no bike lanes at all, and that center turn lane. And so we're going to have to get creative through this area of the corridor. And on the western side, the land use just adjacent to the corridor is really pretty commercial. So there's not so much residential, but yeah, we'll have some work to do through this area. Next slide. So as you kind of continue to the east on this corridor, you run into Midway Park. The Nativity Church is over here. There are some schools and some residential land uses adjacent to the corridor. So it starts to feel a little bit different as you're continuing east. Again, still high traffic volumes. This is an area that gets very congested. This image below shows that intersection with Cole Street, and during the morning, there's a school drop-off that there is just a ton of congestion out there. I think just east of this image, there is also on-street parking. And actually in the top right, you can see some of that drop-off congestion that the school can generate in the morning. This section here continues to have kind of a mix of travel lanes. There's some on-street parking, and the bike facilities continue to be a little bit inconsistent. In the bottom image, you can see it again, it's a shared bike lane, so no designated space for bicyclists. There are also sidewalks through this section. They're not terribly wide, so it is a little bit more challenging to ride a bicycle on there, particularly if there are pedestrians also present in the area. We do see in this image, somebody is riding their bike because they're not comfortable on the street. Next section or slide, please. So the next section, as we move east, is Main Street to Sheridan. I think we need to go. There we go. This is the newest area of the corridor. So this was built either the late 80s or early 90s, but it didn't always exist. And we've talked to some residents at Broomfield days that remember when it wasn't there. This section is very different than anything we've looked at so far. It's characterized by kind of wide single lanes going in either direction. They're separated by a wide vegetated median with mature vegetation. So it really kind of blocks out those other vehicles on the opposite side of the road. There are bike lanes through this section. There is some on-street parking through this section. So that's a little bit nicer for bicyclists out in this area. We have heard some concerns about pedestrian crossing in this area because the mature vegetation can make it very difficult to see people when they're halfway across the street. And so that can cause some problems out in the street. The nice thing about this section is we do have some space between the curbs. So we do have some opportunities for doing work with paint, maybe reconfiguring where the parking is located versus where the bike lane is. There are also some pretty wide sidewalks, at least on the southern side of this section of Midway. All right, next slide, please. So the next section is the entire 4-lane stretch, and this really goes from Sheridan all the way east out to Zuni. This is, I'd say it's similar to that Main Street to Sheridan, except it's 4 lanes now. There continues to be a pretty wide vegetated median. There are wide sidewalks through portions of this area. I think on the southern side of the road, the sidewalk is pretty continuous. But as you can see in the image on the right, there is no sidewalk facility on that north side. That's the Broomfield Commons open space that you're looking at there, and kind of the access to Paul Durder Recreation Center as well. The on-street space, there is a lot of pavement, but with the 2 lanes, there's not a whole lot of space to stripe in a bicycle lane. And in addition to that, this is the area with the highest vehicular speeds. There's 2 lanes of traffic that would be next to you. It's probably the least comfortable area for biking on street, other than, you know, between US 287 and Main Street. I think that kind of categorizes this section, and I will turn it back over to Alicia to lead us through some of the ideas that we're going to be looking at with this project as we move into developing alternatives.
Great. Thank you, Mark, for going through those sections. And I was watching the Q&A, and I'm gonna make a comment on John's question. That's a very astute question because it applies to what we're talking about here. And his question, I think, relates to, yes, all the sections are very different, but how can we make sure that the experience for pedestrians, or the experience for people on bikes, or even the experience traveling in a car is consistent and understandable? And that's one of the goals we've identified for this project from the very start. While we recognize that it might not look the same in every section, we will make every effort to keep as much consistency as possible. And the other thing you start to think about if you aren't able to keep consistency is to make sure that it's very clear when the changes happen, you know, the wayfinding and the markings and the visibility is clear enough that makes it comfortable to make those transitions. So yes, good question. We're working on it.
Yeah, I also think that the predictability of these sections, so that consistency leads to predictability for both bicyclists and pedestrians and vehicles, and that leads to more safety. If people know what to expect out there, there are fewer chances for conflicts because people are anticipating what's going to happen.
Absolutely. So as far as what we're thinking about in the toolbox, the team has done some brainstorming sessions just to get our mind around this, not to actually come up with alternatives yet. And so I've pulled a bunch of images of some ideas. I'm not calling them out in any specific location yet, and they're certainly not the only ideas. So this is going to go through, I'm going to go through a little discussion, mostly to familiarize people with what the different treatments could be. And also, I'm going to ask you at the end if we looked at the right things, if these types of things might make you feel safer. And so keep that in mind as we go through. I do first want to point out, though, that the treatments that I'm going to talk about have all they've definitely all been, implemented before. Most of them have been implemented in communities throughout the Front Range before. And definitely they're all in guidelines that are out there right now. I've shown 3 guidelines up in the corner, 2 national guidelines on kind of more urban streets with NACTO is the organization. One that's close to home with a kind of a DRCOG, which is Denver Regional, Council of Governments. And then also in the bottom here, the bicycle and pedestrian assessment that Mark talked about earlier had a toolbox in it of its own. So this isn't new stuff. Some of it's maybe a little bit outside of what you all have considered before, but it's also being discussed with the Broomfield staff to make sure they're comfortable with it and comfortable with having to maintain it and things like that as we move forward. So let's get into it here. Going to talk about intersections first. You all have seen this graphic before, so we'll talk about some components. Bump out, we're going to start pretty straightforward here. You have bump outs in different parts of Broomfield. And a bump out is just, as I mentioned, a curb extension is another name for it, where basically it extends the curb to things it does. It reduces the crossing distance for this guy walking across here. He doesn't have to be out in the roadway and exposed as long as he would be if he had to make it all the way here. It increases visibility for both the pedestrian to see a car, and it increases the visibility for somebody driving a car to see a pedestrian. And all that means is basically, when you're not trying to peek out behind parked cars or vegetation, it's much more likely that, 2 users will see each other before a conflict occurs. The other thing that bump outs do is they reduce speeds in some instances. They add what we call it for through vehicles, for somebody coming through on this main street here. They add what we call side friction along this face of the curb there. And if there wasn't a car here and it was just open street, it's much more comfortable for a vehicle to go faster. Whereas when the lane feels like it's narrower and a more appropriate width, then if you're driving a car, you're more likely to go an appropriate speed. It also reduces turning speed. In this case, this is a pretty tight radius, but regardless of even if it's a little less tight, a vehicle that's person driving a car coming up here and turning right at this next roadway has to slow down much more to turn. And the great thing about that is that you will be, if I'm driving the car, I am much more likely to see a pedestrian coming across if I'm turning slowly and if I'm turning more completely before I get to that crossing. This picture is another kind of a bump out. It's a little different one. It's just to point out that we can do these in different materials, including more temporary materials. And in this case, it may provide somebody a little bit more visibility, but also allow if you have an occasional large truck through here as well. So different materials, this is a little different than you usually see, but just to kind of start stretching your mind about what we might be considering here. This is a more traditional, typical bump out. Improve the curb ramps, make everything ADA compliant, much more comfortable for people in wheelchairs. And then, have a little bit tighter radius here and have a little bit better visibility. Now, this is kind of a modification on bump out. And what I wanted to tell you about this is actually in Fort Collins on 2 slightly higher volume roadways, like maybe to the east end of Midway. And This facility, this is Horsetooth and College, and Horsetooth has a multi-use path coming along the side. And one of the things that this treatment does is it pulls the multi-use path away from, let's say I'm traveling along this corner, kind of going up to the left side of the screen. If I were to turn right down south on College here, I would get far enough around my turn because that crossing is set back away from the intersection. I would get far enough around my turn that I would be much more kind of perpendicular to a pedestrian or a person on a bicycle who's crossing there. So setting back the crossings, whether it be a pedestrian, protected bike lane, multi-use path, can help with visibility and reducing crashes as well. This is a raised crossing. And so I'm going to talk about a pork chop island. That's this triangle island, which always makes me laugh. But so the industry calls this a pork chop island. If you're trying to get as a pedestrian from the main sidewalk on the side of the road over to the pork chop island to, use the push button to get across the main road. We have a few of these on Midway. One thing you can do to help make that pedestrian crossing more comfortable and actually make it safer is raising the crossing. Usually we see, like at 287 in Midway, we see the ramps come down to the roadway level and then the roadway level goes straight across. But this raising it and adding the additional signage and the additional markings actually slows people down in these yield conditions. The other interesting thing is that the studies have shown that it provides better compliance. So if you're a pedestrian walking across here and you're walking on a raised crosswalk, you are more likely to have a car yield to you. Whereas if it's lower, you're more likely to have to wait for that car to go before you can cross. This one is just to show that we know there are a lot of in-between locations, particularly in some of the areas with different types of driveways and things like that, and smaller intersections. And we're going to be looking at those too. A multi-use, this is an example of a multi-use path crossing a driveway. And in this case, there's been some signage added in this bright yellow-green color. And actually also some markings on the ground just to indicate to people, hey, you might encounter a pedestrian or you might encounter, in this case, some person on a bike as well. So again, we're not going to forget those in-between areas as well. Okay, we can also look at intersections. We can also look at additional striping, ground plane marking. So striping on the road that can help make things more comfortable and help make things more predictable for people driving cars and for people riding bikes in this case. The example I've shown here is not the only one, but this is called a two-stage turn cue box. As it allows you to make a left turn in 2 stages, and it gives you a waiting space to make that turn. So in this case, if I were coming along towards us on the screen and I were riding a bicycle, I would prefer not to get all the way into the left turn lane because I would have to be trying to cross that through lane and merge with traffic. So one way you can do that is with this box, somebody coming on a bicycle comes through on their green and pulls over into the bicycle, the 2-stage turn cue box, and then waits. This traffic gets the red light, and then once this light up here in the top right turns green, that person on a bicycle can go ahead and go, and effectively they've never had to cross over to their left, crossing into sharing the travel lane there. So there are other examples at intersections of additional crossing and marking treatments that we'll be looking at as well. Okay, so we've made it to pedestrian facilities. When we think of pedestrian facilities, the simplest is the sidewalk, but we know through this area there are gaps in the sidewalks in some locations. Some folks have been sharing that the sidewalks aren't wide enough. which is believable. And then some folks have been sharing that they're just not comfortable on the sidewalks, the configuration or the visibility. And so some examples of ideas there, certainly considering widening the sidewalk where possible. I want to point out, though, we know that there's a significant amount of beautiful mature vegetation and a number of locations with tight right-of-ways. And so we're certainly not looking to blow out that vegetation or anything like that. Of course, you may end up with some adjustments, but we know that it's going to be more constrained because of the established nature of these neighborhoods. So one idea, you can widen the sidewalk or construct a multi-use path. If you can't do that, there are some kind of soft surface ways to do that to provide some extra space without making as big of an impact on some of the vegetation. So these are two examples of that type of treatment. And a little bit bigger footprint, we were having a transportation nerd discussion about what this technically qualifies as. And some people would call it a shared use path because it's a path that includes many different uses. But some people would call it a separated two-way bike lane and a sidewalk. It doesn't really matter what it's called. What matters is that it's acting as a wider facility with a way of separating out users, in this case, in a location that has a high volume of users. You wouldn't necessarily do this if you're really not expecting to encounter very many people on bicycle versus very many people who are walking. But some locations where, especially where you have space, having that separation can provide much more comfort, particularly for pedestrians concerned about, a bicyclist coming through at 15 miles an hour. And I'll note too, that this is a good use of materials differences to delineate between the two facility types. And so, it wasn't fancy, but it certainly visually, you can tell there's two different facilities. Other pedestrian facilities, we've heard a lot about crossing concerns. This is an example of, you can see just past the silver car, a pedestrian refuge island. We talked about those earlier. And this is a pedestrian refuge island and a mid-block crosswalk, which just means it's in the middle of the block. It's not at an intersection. And this crosswalk is actually across a 4-lane road, 2 lanes each direction. And one of the reasons, that is one of the reasons it has over here, the state law yield sign is a little different treatment. And it has what we call an RRFB, rectangular rapid flashing beacon, and some additional signage as well as the markings. And these are called yield teeth or yield line, just trying to indicate those cars should stop further back so that they can see past the car next to them if a pedestrian is coming. So this mid-block refuge island and this RRFB combination kind of have different installation criteria depending on roadway configuration, number of lanes, speeds. But the main thing to think about is an RRFB is the highest type of crossing, or kind of most protected type of crossing that is still technically unprotected. That means that drivers must voluntarily yield, if you want to think about it that way, instead of being required to yield by a red indication like you would see at a traffic signal. So I don't have a picture of what some people call a hawk signal or a pedestrian hybrid beacon, same thing. But that would actually be a signal indication, which we'll certainly keep an eye out too, and have their own criteria of where they can be implemented. Another example of a more traditional RRFB and a refuge island with a pedestrian mid-block. And this mid-block I have noted here, not mid-block, pedestrian refuge island I have noted here actually gives us a few different things and kind of a few different benefits. So this reduces conflict points at the intersection by removing some of the conflicting movements. In this case, the left turn was removed. And so this could have been, further down, it could be a two-way left turn lane, those double, where there's two yellow lines and then individual dashes, so you can turn left either direction out of it. And this can allow, in some locations, like further to the east on Midway, you have these tiny little median noses where even if we extended those and provided a refuge in them, it wouldn't be wide enough to get, two or three people on, or one person on a bike. Or so this may be an idea that could provide additional space by using that left turn lane and taking away, the conflict point by disallowing that movement. It's pretty particular. You have to make sure that you've analyzed the impacts and gotten input on it. But just another example, and also showing that the refuge islands are used by people on bikes as well. There we go. So you can also have pedestrian refuge islands at intersections, and this is one of those narrower ones that I was talking about. You can see the kid's bike fits on there. I'm not sure the mom's bike is going to fit on there. But also these pedestrian refuge islands don't only help pedestrians, they help people on bikes as well. And they help a car know where to anticipate a pedestrian or bicyclist may be waiting. All right, through this picture in here, just to show that there are temporary measures, even for something like a pedestrian refuge island, that we may be looking at. You've seen bump outs in different locations with these flex posts as well. And so you can look at, as Mark mentioned, that low hanging fruit, and Sarah mentioned kind of phasing some of these improvements. You can look at using different materials the first time around. Other thing it does is it lets you kind of check the configuration and make sure it's working out for that location. So we'll keep these in mind as well. I put this graphic up here just because sometimes we get stuck down this rabbit hole of thinking, how can we physically change what's on the ground in order to quote unquote fix or improve something? And sometimes it's, especially at intersections, sometimes it's more of an operational improvement that can make a big difference. And operational improvements don't usually take space, although they can impact vehicular traffic enough that makes it require more space. However, this is an example of one that we may consider at some of the signalized intersections. And it's called a leading pedestrian interval, or an LPI. And if you look at the left graphic first, it lets the pedestrian, the signal, the white walking person signal for pedestrians goes while all of the traffic signals are red, and lets those pedestrians start walking across first. And a few seconds after they get out into the roadway and establish themselves in that crosswalk, then it lets a potentially conflicting turning vehicle, gives them the green light. You would never give a green arrow, but this is just if you're like turning turning right on a green circular indication. The pedestrian would already be out in the crosswalk. So you'd go, oh, I can't go yet because that pedestrian is there. That's an LPI, and is one example of an operational change that can help multimodal users. Last up here, I have bicycle facilities, and we're going to talk through some of, again, doesn't cover them all, but some of the ideas that might work on Midway. So this is an example of buffered bike lanes. Again, we have that horizontal separation, but no vertical component. And it also shows green pavement markings. And green pavement markings are being used by many communities right now to mark locations where there may be, they're called conflict locations, where there may be a conflict between somebody riding a bicycle and somebody driving a car. And it's not just to say, hey, could be a conflict here. It tells a person driving a car, hey, keep an eye out, you might encounter a bicycle. And it tells somebody riding a bicycle, okay, be especially aware through here because this is a space that's maybe shared with with a vehicle or a car. In this case, there's green down here as well, because this is actually a bus stop. And so a bus might pull in, into the bike lane in this configuration. There are also other ways to treat bus stops as well. Let's see, one thing I wanted to point out here is that bicycle facilities help pedestrians as well. We'll ignore the pedestrian actually walking in the bicycle facility. Well, some people do that. I'm talking about the fact that if this were a travel lane, a vehicular travel lane before, installing a bicycle facility in this case in the roadway gives added separation. So a person walking on the sidewalk is further away from moving vehicle traffic once that bike lane is installed. So that is one of the things that helps. There also can often help with crossing distances too, with some configurations. So let's see. The next one is a protected bike lane, and I'm gonna try and finish these next few up quickly so we can address some of the other questions coming in. Protected bike lanes are basically, well, there are many configurations, but this example is like a buffered bike lane with a vertical component. These are a little bit newer and nicer flexible posts, or flexible bollards that can be installed similar to the temporary installation I showed you in that buffer area. And so now this is the bike lane coming at me here. This guy's turning into that bike lane on the other side. So that's one type of protected bike lane. Another kind of protected bike lane, this is called a raised protected bike lane or separated bike lane, or some people call them cycle tracks. And this one provides, some people feel like this is more comfortable because it has that curb space or that curb separation. And it also has obviously different construction costs and different maintenance challenges as well. So it just has, different characteristics and is a different type of protected bike lane. I have this cost slide up here, and this is not to study and to think that this is how we're making our decisions, but this is real money that's required to install and maintain these facilities. And it's your taxes, really. And that's why we're flagging it here. This, as I mentioned, is not the only thing that we're going to think about, but we want to make sure, out of respect for the people who are going to have to maintain these and have to pay for installation, that we at least keep it in mind. And again, providing additional comfort and safety can also increase the cost. So something we'll keep in mind. Okay. That whole world of possibilities of what we might apply to Broomfield when we're looking through alternatives. I'd like to ask you some questions about the possibilities we just presented. And the questions I'll pop up in a poll here are basically just about, whether you think we're looking at the right types of things specifically. So I'm going to launch this poll. There are 3 questions here. And then they also request that you share in the chat if, which ones you think will work, which ones won't work, what we missed. So we'll leave this one up for a little bit so you can put additional info in the chat. Here we go. Okay, looks like we're getting a few answers here. Okay. I'll wait just one more minute on this one. Let's see. All right. We've got still answering. Okay, and please answer or please provide additional info in the chat. I'm gonna end the poll here in just 5 seconds. Okay, let's share the results. And I'm might put you all on the spot depending on what answers we have here. So first question is whether you think the ideas presented are applicable to Midway. And everybody said yes. And so the next question on that one is, which ones do you think are the most applicable? Which ones are the most exciting to you? So John, I know you've been submitting a few things here. Feel free to put something in the chat there. I did notice, and we'll address it right now while we're waiting for that, that you mentioned the RFB spot in Boulder, and that is a challenging location. So it looks like that, at least that type of RFB treatment is not one that you would think would be great on Midway. So I'm going to go to the next one here. Would any of these ideas presented make Midway safer, more equitable, and more comfortable? Same question applies there. Looks like we've got yes answers on that as well, which is good. Tells us we're at least down the right track here. So again, please share with us which ones you think are would make you feel the safest. If there's a particular slide you want me to go back to, I'm happy to do that as well. And the last thing we have here is Q&A, so we can certainly open it up then too. The third question, are there other options this team should consider for Midway Boulevard? And we have a yes and we have a maybe. So that one definitely requires some additional info. So let's see, John, Cheryl, can you put something in the chat about which additional ideas you have?
Alicia, I thought I would address the RRFB comment here about perhaps the installation at Pearl Street seems unsafe. And I don't have the statistics in front of me about that condition, but I'm not sure how old it is, but there are some other treatments that are now available, including the pedestrian hybrid beacon, which can also be known in some circles as the Hawk. It's very similar to what we've installed at Sheps Crossing and Industrial Lane. So that's another alternative, and perhaps the location in Boulder, perhaps the PHB would be more appropriate in that location. So we would definitely want to do that analysis to be sure we're putting in the correct crossing treatment.
Thanks, that's a good point, Sarah. And I would also note that any crossing treatment with 2 lanes in each direction is significantly harder to address, in a safe and comfortable manner than it is with 1 lane. So, considering placement of your crossings too, we want to make sure we have crossings available where people are needing them, but you can maybe adjust placement based on, what kind of treatment is available as well. And let's see, so I see Cheryl in response to some of this. Bike lanes on Midway have raised or pool separation, so some vertical separation would be helpful. And many bicyclists share the sidewalks right now, which can be difficult, especially if somebody has a dog, which is a very good point. And as Mark mentioned, the sidewalks in some locations are very narrow. So if we, in some section, if the ultimate recommendation is to have more off-street facility, then we'll make sure that it's wide enough that both uses can share it at the same time. John points out the RFB on Main Street near Community Park is much better example, of what works. The street is 2 lanes only and cars are moving slower. Yeah, it's a good condition.
That one, if I'm thinking of it correctly, it might be at where there's a path from Emerald Park, I think, crossing. And I think that's actually one of the Hawk signals. So you push the button and you get a red bulb. And it does work great. It's worked great for me in the past. That is something, that can be a challenge with those rapid flashing beacons is they're voluntary. So people don't don't necessarily stop if they're not paying attention. When you have, particularly when you have 4 lanes of traffic, it can be difficult with the first car coming up and the second car maybe not seeing them if they're in the second lane. So we need to be thoughtful about where we deploy those, and figuring out how do we create a safe situation while keeping vehicles moving through the corridor. And I think there's probably some good solutions out there we can explore.
Mhm. Absolutely. And Cheryl had another comment too about that she experienced a near accident crossing Midway where there's a large amount of center foliage. You're not the first person we've heard this comment from, and I've noticed it as a driver driving through there as well. She asked if there's a way to alert drivers better that could be helpful. And we've talked a lot about what the reasons are, both the visibility issues created by some of that beautiful established landscaping, but also I think some of it has to do with the roadway. It's an east-west roadway, so often, especially when the sun is further to the south, there's some shadows across the roadway, and so that can kind of confuse drivers and create visibility challenges for people crossing. That's going to be a tough one because everybody likes the way that section feels, but everybody is also uncomfortable crossing there. So we're going to have to figure out how to put those two together and make it both actually safer and especially emphasize the more comfortable piece too. So good to hear about not good to hear about your near miss. Thank you for sharing your near miss, and feel free, we'll put a note on the online map, but feel free to add that type of thing with the near misses online as well.
I think through that section as well, sometimes the driver can feel like nobody's around and kind of isolated because they are in this green tunnel. You're not seeing anything. There's no other traffic. And so you kind of might get lost in your own world, and you stop expecting or anticipating that people might be there. And that's something we need to think about. As Alicia was saying, how do we find a solution? Because we do like the feel, or most people seem like they like the feel of that section. So it's going to take some thinking on that one.
Okay, and I think we're technically on Q&A now. I think we covered everything else. John, I know you had a specific comment or question about comments that you've placed, and we're going to be getting to responding to those online when we can soon here. And yep, everything else. So team, did we miss anything in terms of response? And I guess attendees, is there anything else you wanted to ask before we move on to just the closing and next steps?
So Alicia, it looks like John included one more discussion point, and it's about noise on the corridor.
I missed it. It's in the
just popped up, and I think that this is something we've also heard is sometimes you get those really loud exhaust systems on big trucks or maybe on little Honda vehicles. And would slowing cars on Midway help improve kind of the quality of life as it relates to that noise pollution? And, I think this one is a really challenging issue for us to control because it's about changing behavior of people and maybe changing their hobbies. And so I think we can do some enforcement with law enforcement if people are breaking noise ordinances or those types of things, but it's really difficult to regulate, how loud somebody's muffler is if they like that kind of thing. Sarah, I don't know if you have anything to add about that, or Alicia, if you have any ideas about noise. I think slowing people down can certainly help, but a loud muffler is just a loud muffler in my experience.
Well, and I do think that John points out that he's saying, let's exhaust systems aside. So let's say that it's not just an individual kind of drag racing or something, but he mentions the 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. time as well. And that's just when there's a lot of traffic. So slowing down traffic can help for two reasons, because of engine noise and because of pavement noise. the slowing down is, helps pavement noise as well. And also the end goal, honestly, to the first slide Mark talked about, encouraging modal choice and some potential mode shift. If we can get more people to be walking and biking through this corridor instead of driving through this corridor, that would be the ultimate, way to help address that. And we know that that's a real challenge right now, but at least once you provide the facilities, that opportunity is there as well. So I would say speed changes and, volume changes are the biggest.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And one other thought that I think I'll add is that the state is moving towards supporting electrification of our transportation system. And electric cars are much quieter than combustion engines. And so I do think over time we will see a change in the noise levels on our roadways in the coming years. So something to keep in mind. And of course, the pollution benefits as well.
That's a good point. Okay, great. Well, I know we're just 1 minute over here, so I'm going to turn it back over to Mark for next steps.
All right, we're going to run one very quick poll question, and this is really aimed at making sure we're engaging a representative cross-section of the Broomfield community. And so I guess I'll launch this right now as I talk through the next steps and let you answer that. But this is really just asking about how you describe your ethnicity. So next steps, we are going to be moving into developing alternatives with the feedback and the data that we've collected thus far. We will be coming back to the public, potentially at some events. We haven't identified them for the fall and winter yet, but definitely some additional public meetings coming up later this year. You can stay involved and find out the latest project information. We will be updating the Broomfield Voice page for this project periodically throughout the fall as we get more information. You can visit the website at www.broomfieldvoice.com/Midway Plan. You can also contact us via email at transportation@broomfield.org. Please include Midway Plan in the subject line so that we know that your comment is about this project. You can also call the hotline for this project and leave a message, a comment, a question, and that's at 303-464-5827. And with that, we are wrapping up the meeting tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, please go back and check out the website. Add your comments to the map, and we'll have some other engagement activities coming up in the coming months here. Have a great evening, and thank you so much.
Thank you, folks.